The war with Persia is remembered as a Greek victory. For thousands of women, it marked the beginning of something worse. Their story begins not in combat, but after Salamis fell silent. Let's focus on what occurred once the battle was finished. After Salamis, in 479 BCE, the naval battle near Salamis had ended, but its consequences were still unfolding along the Greek coast. The remains of destroyed ships washed ashore in the days that followed, leaving physical evidence of the conflict scattered across the beaches. Burned wood, damaged equipment, and abandoned weapons marked the shoreline, while later accounts would frame this moment as a decisive Greek victory. Conditions on land reflected a more complex reality. As Persian forces withdrew, they did not leave without securing civilian captives. Temporary encampments were established along the coast to hold populations taken from cities that had been occupied, evacuated, or destroyed during the campaign. These camps were not military installations. They functioned as holding areas where civilians were gathered, counted, and prepared for transport. The people confined there were primarily women and children. Many had survived the destruction of their cities, only to be captured during the Persian retreat. Their treatment during this period received little attention in later Greek histories, which focused instead on battles, commanders, and political outcomes. This stage of the war marked a transition. Open combat had ended, but administrative procedures continued. The removal and redistribution of civilian populations became part of the Persian withdrawal strategy. What occurred in these camps would shape thousands of lives, even as public memory moved on to celebrating victory at sea. The spoils no one counts. When Persian forces withdrew from Greece, they did not leave behind an empty landscape. What remained was a civilian population already damaged by occupation and war. Now exposed to the final stage of imperial control, taking people was not a side effect of the campaign. It was an accepted outcome, anticipated as clearly as the seizure of territory or supplies. Across the ancient world, conquest routinely included the removal of women and children. What distinguished the Persian response was not novelty, but organization. Civilians were gathered deliberately from regions that had resisted or been abandoned during the fighting. They were held under guard, separated from what remained of their communities, and prepared for transport eastward. Their value lay in survival, not death. Later, Greek memory treated this phase as unimportant. Victories were counted in ships destroyed and armies broken. The removal of families did not fit a story built around heroic defense. It was easier to compress them into a sentence or omit them entirely. For the empire, however, these captives represented continuity. Every woman taken weakened a household left behind and strengthened another far away. Communities lost daughters, future mothers, and social stability. The empire gained labor, dependency, and influence that extended beyond the battlefield. Victory for marble, silence for flesh. Once the Persians were driven back, Greek cities moved quickly to define what the war would mean. Public memory took shape through monuments, dedications, and speeches that emphasized resistance and survival. Victory was framed as collective and clean. Losses were acknowledged only where they reinforced sacrifice on the battlefield. What did not serve that purpose was set aside. The civilians taken during the retreat had no place in this narrative. They were not present at assemblies. Their absence could not be displayed in temples or carved into stone. To speak openly about them would have meant admitting that the war continued beyond the moment of triumph, and that its costs were unevenly distributed. Men who died fighting could be honored. Their deaths reinforced civic identity. Women who vanished into captivity did the opposite. Their stories complicated ideas of purity, continuity, and communal strength. Remembering them required acknowledging vulnerability, dependence, and failure to protect those without arms. As a result, silence became a form of resolution. The war was declared finished because the public story demanded closure. Their suffering did not challenge the outcome of the war, but it threatened the meaning assigned to it. That threat was managed, not through denial, but through omission. History advanced, leaving gaps where living people had once been. Xerxes and the machinery of empire. Xerxes I ruled an empire that depended on systems more than spectacle. Its power did not come only from armies, but from administration that extended into every conquered region. Long before Greece was invaded, Persia had refined methods for absorbing defeated populations into imperial control. War opened the door. Bureaucracy decided what followed. The Persian state operated through records, officials, and logistical planning that moved alongside military force. Conquest created problems that had to be managed, displaced people, destroyed economies, unstable territories. These were not left to chance. Decisions were made about relocation, labor, and long-term usefulness. Civilians were part of that calculation. Xerxes did not need to invent these practices. He inherited them. What made the Greek campaign significant was the scale of resistance and the symbolic importance of the cities involved. Greece was not simply another province. Its defiance challenged imperial authority. The response extended beyond the battlefield. Killing enemies ended resistance in the moment. Removing populations reshaped the future. Through controlled displacement and enforced dependency, the empire could weaken hostile regions without constant occupation. This approach did not require cruelty for its own sake. It required efficiency. Under Xerxes, conquest functioned as a process, not an outburst, and its effects reached far beyond the war itself. Control through women. Once cities fell or were abandoned, Persian authority shifted focus from combat to population management. Women were central to that process. They represented continuity, labor, and reproduction. Removing them altered communities in ways no burned building could. A city could rebuild walls. It could not easily replace its daughters. Captive women were separated from remaining family members as early as possible. This was not incidental. Isolation reduced resistance and prevented collective action. Age mattered. Younger girls were easier to adapt. Older women were assigned to labor where survival depended on compliance. The goal was not punishment alone, but long-term utility. Across the empire, displaced women were absorbed into households, estates, and workshops. Their identities were reshaped through language, custom, and dependency. Children born to them would grow up detached from their mother's origins, loyal to the structures that fed and housed them. This outcome required no mass executions and produced no heroic deaths. By targeting women, imperial power reached forward rather than backward. It weakened defeated societies, not just in the present, but in generations that followed. Control achieved this way left little trace in victory records. It did not interrupt celebrations or monuments. It worked quietly, altering futures, while history recorded something else entirely. the sorting after capture. Civilians were not treated as a single group, they were divided. This separation happened quickly and under supervision. Age, physical condition, and perceived usefulness determined where each person would be sent. Families were broken apart early in the process to prevent coordination or resistance. Once separated, reunification was unlikely. Young children were removed first. They could be reshaped over time with less effort. Older women were assigned to labor roles where survival depended on obedience. Those in between were evaluated more closely. Their futures were decided individually, not by chance, but by assessment. This was not chaos following war. It was organization replacing it. Guards enforced silence. Movement was controlled. Names were recorded, altered, or discarded depending on destination. Language became a barrier rather than a tool. Orders were issued in tongues the captives did not understand, reinforcing dependency from the beginning. This stage mattered because it set the trajectory of everything that followed. Once assigned, a person's path rarely changed. The sorting reduced human lives into categories that could be managed across distance and time. It transformed loss into procedure. Holding camps before anyone was moved east, many captives were kept in temporary camps along the coast and inland routes. These were not long-term settlements. They existed to stabilize control. Movement was restricted. Contact with the outside was cut off. Time inside these places was undefined, which was part of their function. Life in the camps followed strict routines. Food was limited and irregular. Clean water was controlled. Sleeping space was crowded. The uncertainty wore people down faster than force. Days passed without information about what would happen next or whether release was possible. Hope became difficult to maintain when nothing changed. Language barriers were enforced rather than resolved. Orders were delivered through gestures or translators who did not explain more than necessary. Punishment was public enough to be instructive, restrained enough to avoid chaos. The aim was compliance, not spectacle. These camps were designed to interrupt memory. People lost track of dates, seasons, and distance from home. Isolation weakened identity. By the time transport orders came, many captives no longer resisted. Not because they accepted their fate, but because the structure surrounding them had made resistance feel pointless. Records without faces, as captives moved deeper into imperial control. They became entries rather than individuals. Officials documented numbers, conditions, and destinations using systems designed for efficiency. What mattered was whether a person could work, travel, or survive relocation. Personal history carried no administrative value. Records followed people where memory could not. Names were shortened, altered, or replaced. Ages were estimated. Relationships were ignored unless they affected productivity. This information allowed distant authorities to manage human movement without ever seeing those being moved. Decisions were made far from the camps, based on lines written by people who would never hear the consequences. This process reduced suffering into data. Hunger became a ration problem. Injury became a delay. Death became an adjustment. The system did not require cruelty from every individual involved. It required participation. Once written down, a person could be reassigned, transferred, or forgotten with equal ease. The existence of records gave the appearance of order. In reality, they concealed violence by translating it into neutral terms. The captives understood this quickly. Being recorded did not mean protection. It meant permanence within a system that no longer recognized who they had been. Breaking resistance, not all captives responded to confinement in the same way, and the system accounted for that difference from the beginning. Some women resisted openly by refusing orders, withholding labor, or clinging to their language and customs despite repeated punishment. Others resisted quietly by slowing their work, avoiding instruction, or maintaining private rituals when they believed they were unobserved. These behaviors were not unexpected, and they were never treated as misunderstandings. Imperial control did not rely on constant violence to address defiance. Instead, pressure was applied gradually and selectively. Food allocations were reduced, workloads increased, and isolation imposed where resistance persisted. Separation from others proved especially effective, as it removed solidarity and reinforced dependence on authority for basic survival. Over time, endurance mattered more than courage. Younger captives learned which behaviors brought marginal relief and which invited further restriction. Older women learned that persistence carried consequences that accumulated rather than resolved. The system did not demand agreement, only compliance, and it rewarded adaptation without acknowledging what had been surrendered in exchange. This process eliminated resistance without public punishment or spectacle. People did not vanish suddenly. Their disappearance left no record of defiance, only an absence that the system absorbed without interruption. Those who adapted survival within the imperial system often depended on a willingness to adjust, even when that adjustment came at the cost of identity. Women who learned the dominant language, followed expected customs, and complied with instruction were treated differently from those who resisted. This distinction was not framed as reward, but it had real consequences for daily life. Adaptation brought marginal improvements rather than safety. Food became more consistent. Labor became less punishing. Supervision loosened slightly. These changes encouraged further compliance without ever offering genuine freedom. Over time, survival itself became evidence that adaptation was working. Some women were absorbed into households or administrative environments where obedience and familiarity were valued. There, they were expected to perform roles that reinforced imperial norms, passing them on through daily practice. Children born in these conditions inherited the system before they inherited memory. Their upbringing was shaped by the structures that sustained them, not by the cultures their mothers had lost. This outcome did not require loyalty in the emotional sense. It required routine. Through repetition, language replaced language, custom replaced custom, and dependency replaced choice. The result was not transformation in a single moment, but a gradual erosion of what had once defined home. Messages that survived very little, written by captive women, has reached the present, and what remains is indirect and fragmentary. Their voices survive not through full accounts, but through traces embedded in later records, family recollections, and marginal references that historians long treated as insignificant. Absence itself becomes evidence when silence is patterned rather than accidental. Some women managed limited contact with relatives left behind, usually through intermediaries who carried messages across regions. These communications were cautious and restrained, shaped by fear of interception and punishment. What they conveyed was rarely descriptive. Instead, they focused on reassurance, compliance, and survival. Details of daily life were avoided, not because nothing happened, but because too much could not be said safely. The most revealing feature of these messages is what they omit. References to names, rituals, or past identity fade over time. Language becomes formal and detached. Home is acknowledged indirectly as something remembered rather than expected. The shift suggests adaptation enforced by distance and dependence, not reconciliation. For historians, these fragments challenge comfortable narratives. They show continuity of life without continuity of self. The women who wrote did not vanish entirely, but they did not return unchanged. Children of the system, children born to captive women, entered the world already bound to imperial structures. Their earliest experiences were shaped by households, estates, or workshops that functioned according to Persian norms. Language, dress, and ritual were learned through daily repetition, not instruction. These children did not experience displacement. They inherited stability built on their mother's loss. Maternal origins carried little weight in determining their future. What mattered was loyalty, usefulness, and familiarity with administrative order. As they grew, these children occupied a space between worlds, though only one was acknowledged. The culture of their mothers existed, at most, as fragments remembered privately and rarely shared. This arrangement served the empire well. Children raised within its systems required no coercion to participate in them. They understood authority as routine rather than force. When assigned roles later in life, whether as laborers, scribes, or minor officials, they carried no sense of having been taken from somewhere else. For the women who gave birth to them, this was a quiet, final separation. Their children survived, but without inheritance of language, memory, or belonging. The empire gained continuity without conquest, extending control through people who never learned to imagine an alternative. Return without welcome. A small number of women eventually found their way back to Greek cities in the years following the wars. Some were released after long service. Others were ransomed by families who had waited without certainty. A few returned through escape or the collapse of local authority. Their return, however, did not restore what had been taken. Time in captivity altered how they were seen. Language had changed. Customs had shifted. Some returned with children whose origins could not be ignored. Greek communities, still defining themselves through victory and resistance, struggled to place these women within civic life. Their presence disrupted the boundaries that victory had drawn. Citizenship depended on purity of lineage and continuity of household. Women who had lived under foreign control challenged both. Sympathy existed, but it rarely translated into acceptance. Families hesitated to reclaim daughters whose lives no longer fit communal expectations. Cities hesitated to recognize children who embodied the enemy they had fought. For many returnees, survival had come at the cost of belonging. Home existed geographically, but not socially. They were present but uncounted, visible but excluded. The silent women who returned from captivity, rarely spoke publicly about where they had been or what had happened to them. Silence was not only imposed from outside, it was learned as a form of survival. Speaking risked rejection, suspicion, or renewed isolation in communities that preferred uncomplicated stories of victory. These women lived on the edges of civic life. They moved through markets, temples, and streets without recognition or protection. Their experiences did not translate into honor or sympathy. Instead, they marked them as reminders of vulnerability at a time when Greek identity depended on strength and independence. Over time, this silence became structural. Their stories were not recorded in civic decrees or historical accounts. When mentioned at all, they appeared briefly and without detail, stripped of context and voice. The absence was not accidental. Remembering these women would have required acknowledging that conquest left scars beyond the battlefield. Forgetting allowed societies to move forward without confronting that cost. As years passed, silence hardened into erasure. These women survived war and captivity, yet disappeared from memory. What the ground reveals long after written histories narrowed their focus to battles and leaders. The physical record preserved a different account. Burials from the decades following the Persian Wars show patterns that do not align with stories of swift recovery and renewed stability. The remains of women from this period often display signs of prolonged deprivation rather than sudden catastrophe. Skeletal evidence points to extended malnutrition, repeated physical strain, and injuries consistent with hard labor rather than combat. In some cases, indications of early childbirth appear alongside markers of chronic stress. These details suggest lives shaped by disruption over time, not brief displacement. They reflect conditions endured elsewhere before death, not experiences limited to Greek soil. Grave goods, when present, are minimal. Names are often absent. The dead are not marked as citizens or commemorated through lineage. Instead, they appear anonymous, folded back into the earth without narrative. This absence mirrors the silence found in written sources. Archaeology cannot provide personal testimony, but it can challenge official memory. The ground preserves what texts ignore. It records the cost of survival, carried in bodies rather than words. Through these remains, it becomes clear that the war's consequences did not end with victory. Rethinking victory, measured by territory and military outcomes. Greece survived the Persian invasion. Cities rebuilt, alliances formed, political life resumed, and, in some places, expanded. These facts shaped how victory was defined and remembered. They also narrowed the lens through which the war's impact was understood. Victory, as it was publicly framed, depended on closure. It required a clear ending point and a sense that loss had been contained. Civilian suffering that extended beyond the battlefield disrupted that structure. It suggested that the war's effects were uneven and ongoing, reaching into households rather than stopping at city walls. For those taken and not returned, victory offered no protection. Their absence did not weaken political institutions immediately, but it altered social continuity over time. Families ended, lineages broke, entire futures were redirected elsewhere. None of this contradicted military success, but it complicated its meaning. Rethinking victory requires acknowledging outcomes that were never intended to be celebrated. The war did not only decide who controlled land or sea routes, it determined whose lives would continue within familiar structures and whose would be absorbed into systems beyond recognition. Survival and success were not shared equally, even among those counted as winners. The cost that could not be celebrated, the consequences of the war, extended into areas that public commemoration could not easily address. Losses suffered by civilians did not translate into symbols of unity or strength. They offered no clear moral lesson that could be shaped into ceremony or monument. As a result, these costs remained outside collective remembrance. Public memory favored events that reinforced shared identity. Battles could be framed as moments of courage and resolve. Defeat could be explained or redeemed. The disappearance of women and children resisted such framing. Their absence did not inspire cohesion. It raised questions about protection, responsibility, and failure that victory narratives were designed to avoid. Acknowledging these losses would have required confronting uncomfortable realities about power and vulnerability. It would have meant admitting that survival depended on more than bravery or strategy. Some lives were protected by circumstance, others abandoned by necessity. This distinction undermined the idea of collective triumph. By leaving these stories unspoken, societies preserved a simplified account of the war. Celebration continued without interruption. Yet beneath that surface, entire lines of descent had been severed. The cost existed, but it could not be honored without disturbing the meaning assigned to victory itself. Silence as strategy. Silence after the war did not arise naturally. It served a practical function. Open discussion of civilians taken during the conflict would have complicated the meaning of victory and created low demands that cities were unwilling to meet. Forgetting offered stability where acknowledgement would have required responsibility. This silence operated across families, institutions, and historical writing. Households avoided conversations that carried shame without remedy. Civic authorities focused on rebuilding power rather than accounting for absence. Historians narrowed their attention to battles, leaders, and outcomes that could be explained without confronting unresolved loss. Over time, omission reshaped memory. Later generations inherited a version of the war stripped of displacement and long captivity. The absence of these stories was interpreted as absence of harm. Silence, therefore, became active rather than passive. By excluding these women from record and ritual, societies completed the work that force had begun. Erasure was achieved through repetition alone. What endured, despite deliberate forgetting, traces of what occurred were never fully erased. They remain scattered across the historical and material record, not as complete stories, but as disruptions, a burial without family markers, a name recorded once and never again, a demographic absence that cannot be explained by battle alone. These fragments signal lives diverted into other systems rather than destroyed outright. What endured was not memory, but evidence of removal. Administrative societies leave marks even when they suppress voices. Bodies retain stress. Landscapes retain gaps. Communities reveal imbalance when generations do not align as expected. These signs point to outcomes that celebration attempted to smooth over. For those who study the period, the task is not reconstruction in detail, but recognition of pattern. The war redistributed people as effectively as it redistributed power. Some were absorbed into distant futures. Others vanished between categories history preferred to keep separate. Endurance, in this context, does not mean survival with continuity. It means the persistence of absence. What remains is the outline of lives redirected, proving that victory ended fighting, not consequences. Refusing erasure, the final impact of this history lies not in conquest, but in memory. The women taken during the war were removed from their cities, their families, and eventually from public record. What threatened them most was not only captivity, but the gradual disappearance of their existence from collective awareness. Remembering them does not reverse what was done. It disrupts the idea that victory resolved all harm. It acknowledges that power operates beyond battlefields, shaping lives through administration, neglect, and time. These women were not forgotten because they were insignificant. They were forgotten because their experiences challenged the story societies preferred to preserve. Refusing erasure requires attention to what records omit and what material evidence suggests indirectly. It accepts uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. The goal is not to claim full knowledge, but to deny silence its final authority. Wars end, but their effects persist unevenly. Each act of recognition restores a measure of presence to those removed from history. Their lives cannot be recovered, but they can be named as having existed. That recognition stands against systems that relied on forgetting to complete their work.